Rangers fans, welcome to Liberty Blue, the essential New York Rangers podcast. I'm Andrew Chelney. That's Nick Zararis. And oh, by the way, surprise, we are now a part of the Believe network of podcasts. So you can find us on there as well as wherever else you've been listening to our podcasts already. So super excited for that partnership to get going. Nick, it's the middle of August, and you had a really cool idea for us to get into today.
So straight up, I will lay out the criteria and then the logic behind the criteria. So back in the day when FIFA was fun to play, YouTubers used to do things called squad builder challenges where they would open packs to try and build teams based on certain criteria, X number of nations, X number of clubs, leagues, etc., and trying to do it in a timely, efficient manner to make it competitive, to flex how much you understand, about the game. And I thought about how we could apply that to a hockey sense. And as a general manager of God knows how many fantasy football teams, you like to think you have a baseline understanding of how this stuff works. So in the interest of making it sporting, competitive, there's some criteria to operate from. And number one, we set the salary cap relatively low, $71.5 million, because a lot of these contracts, a lot of these players are from 2010 to 2020, where the salary cap, if you'll recall, that first season out of that short half season lockout in 2012-13, the salary cap was like $41.5 million that season. So we wanted to operate in somewhere of a middle ground. We're going to be at 95.5 this upcoming fall. So that number is too high for a lot of these contracts. So that's the first criteria. Number two, you need to pick a specific year of a given player. You cannot just say, I want Rick Nash. You need to say, I want 2013-14 Rick Nash, and the cost of the player is affiliated with the season you pick. So you can't pick 2014-15 rookie Kevin Hayes and then have it at that cap number if you wanted, say, the 17-18 iteration of him. The other last tidbit to this is, you are only allowed to have one entry-level contract on your team to make this competitive, because very easily you could run the kid line from 21-22, all three of those guys at 9.25, and it becomes a lot less challenging when you have an above replacement level value lineup. So with that criteria in mind, we're going to go back and forth talking about this. This is a good way to remember some guys while also talking about it in a team building perspective. Because one of the things, and we talked about this on last week's show where we talked pretty in depth about the Rangers salary cap management, the Rangers don't get a lot of excess value. They pay for exactly what they get, or they pay more than what they get out of their guys. And this type of exercise forces you to prioritize. Do you want to build a deep lineup? Do you want to build a really top-heavy skilled lineup and then try and bargain bin your way through the bottom half of the lineup? Andrew already kind of gave away one of his big reveals for his lineup construction before we started recording, and I think that's going to inform a lot of what his roster ultimately looks like. So let's start with the most straightforward and the most important. We'll start in net because the Rangers have been goalie-centric teams for much of the last 15 years, and we'll work our way backwards. So, obviously, you have two choices, Henrik Lundqvist and Igor Shesterkin. Now, the first question becomes, what is more important, the ceiling or the value? Because Henrik Lundqvist is in the Hockey Hall of Fame. He's won an Olympic gold medal. He has a Vezina trophy. He's got some of the best playoff numbers, best Game 7 numbers of any goalie in the salary cap, let alone all time in the history of the NHL. Whereas Shesterkin, you have the opportunity to get him at a cheaper price point and the capacity to play close enough to Lundqvist that you can make that money work depending on what you value. So, Andrew, which player or players did you take in net, and which versions, what year, what vintage?
So this is the only part of the roster that's not rooted in reality for me. Like, this is, I pick both because I'm not choosing my favorite child and you're not making me. So for the goalies, I have Lundqvist in 2012, the year he won the Vezina. He was making 6.875, and I have Shesterkin 2022, 5.67. Those are my two goalies. I understand, money-wise and also logically, not the most, we're building a fantasy team here for a second. I know, in real life, these two goalies wouldn't be on the same team. That wouldn't make any sense. But that's kind of the only part of this where it's not remotely rooted in reality. Like, let me get both. I'm not picking. You're not making me.
Okay, so which version of Shesterkin did you take?
2022.
Yeah, that's who my starting goalie is, the 21-22 version of Shesterkin, the one that won the Vezina. That was the best goalie in the world. That's the best goalie season up until Connor Hellebuyck this past year, since Carey Price won the Hart Trophy in 2016, 2017. So I think no matter what, you're doing well. I saw an interesting clip debating this, having this conversation with, I think it was Richter on Lundqvist's podcast where they were talking about this, of where the host had asked a question of like, do you guys think about it in terms of, you passed it off to him and you passed it off? And what Richter had said, and I think is important, and we've said this ourselves, is they're their own guys. And yeah, it's fun to talk about them in comparison. And that's how sports is. You're always trying to be competitive, trying to be the best. But you lose sight of how good guys are when you're constantly comparing them to one another. This is the same reason the perpetual LeBron Jordan debate has reached jumping the shark status, because, yeah, Jordan's got the 6 rings and 6 tries, but LeBron's got the most points in the history of basketball. Like, are we really going to get that much out of splitting hairs to this degree? I don't think there's a right answer there as far as Shesterkin versus Lundqvist for this exercise. I think, especially when you're factoring the salary cap and the amount, I think I chose a little bit more depth. So having, 10 and a half, 11 tied up in 2 goalies, the Rangers are going to try and make it work with 12 million in real life tied up between 2 goalies. So, and the salary cap a lot higher, of course. And then my backup, I went for as much value as you could get. Cam Talbot on a $560,000 a year deal, which I didn't know NHL contracts went that low, but I guess 2013, 14, last decade they were. And because that wasn't an entry level, his entry level contract was like $200,000. That first one he signed out of Alabama, Huntsville. And then he signed a couple of 2 years and then ultimately, of course, got traded to Edmonton. Okay. Now, in constructing our respective defenses, I don't know what the easiest way to do this is. I think it's probably going back and forth pair by pair. So starting with my first pair, I am taking the 2016-17 Ryan McDonagh at 4.7 million. And then the first pair right there, it has to be Adam Fox's 2021-2022 season at 925,000. That was really the biggest question mark for me, was who I was going to use my ELC on. And I think being that Shesterkin's best season was an RFA money year, I think you would be silly to not take Fox's entry-level contract. I mean, he won the Norris Trophy on an ELC. The year after, when they went to the Eastern Conference Final against Tampa Bay, I would argue he was even better than the year he won the Norris Trophy. And then McDonagh at 4.7 to get 95th percentile defense on a first pair to complement Adam Fox, and McDonagh really only has to worry about the defense, retrievals, breakouts. I think that's your ideal first pair, and it comes in at $5.5, 6 million. And you think about what the Rangers have spent $6 million on over the last few years, and you start to pound your head against the wall.
I have the same one, but I have McDonagh from 2014 because that Cup team had, I mean, he was playing really well. Also, that Cup team had so much aura that it's tough to not pick somebody from that. But yeah, McDonagh at 4.7 mil at that time, and same thing with me, Adam Fox getting the entry level from 2021. I mean, listen, when you win the Norris Trophy on an entry level contract, that is EA Sports NHL 25 levels of absurdity. Like, that's so silly to think about, that, a rookie that's still on his prime, like, first contract, not even making $1 million. He's so good. He is the best player on the planet at his position. Absurd. If you pick anybody other than Fox, I mean, like, if you want to argue somebody over McDonagh, we can have that argument. But if you don't pick Fox, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's really an argument for anyone else, especially if you're going to stick to the rigidness of the righty-lefty distribution, which I think for an exercise like this, it makes sense to do. My second pair, I have K'Andre Miller from 2 years ago, the year they won the President's Trophy, at 3.8 million. And then on his right, I have Anton Strahlman at 1.7 million from 2013-2014. That Strahlman contract, one of the best values in the league that season. He was, I want to say, something in the ballpark of 8 million in value and wins above replacement when you use Evolving Wilds model. So you get really nice balance, you get upside, and you get defensive responsibility. And I think, frankly, that'll end up being the Rangers' mismanagement legacy of K'Andre Miller, that they put him with a guy who thought he was an offensive defenseman in Jacob Trouba, and the Rangers said, no, he's a defense guy, but then did nothing to actually facilitate playing defense, and then wondered why K'Andre Miller didn't really make any progress in his decision-making. Well, because both guys think they're doing the same thing. That's why. I mean, it reached a point where, Trouba's a defensive defense. Is he? You reach a certain point where it just doesn't make sense.
People, Nick. I mean,
hitting people and blocking shots for $800,000 is fine. For $8 million per year, you got to give me something more than that. And look, of course, we know this now. In hindsight, if they knew Fox was going to be as good as he was, they would have never traded for Jacob Trouba. They wouldn't have. It would have been silly. Because you think about it, especially in the context of the fact they already had Tony DeAngelo too, and then they drafted Braden Schneider. You had 4 NHL caliber right-handed defensemen on the same team. Trouba was making 8. I want to say DeAngelo was making 4. You draft Fox on the ELC, okay, and then you draft Schneider, and it just really, and I get it, like you want to have as many dart throws at the board as possible, and we're talking about prospects, in relation Fox, DeAngelo, Schneider, but at the same time, you were paying $14 million for 3 right-handed defensemen, and the best one turned out to be the cheapest of the 3.
Yeah, no, I totally agree there. I mean, it's, man, I really, really wish the Rangers, crystal ball and all, obviously hindsight's 2020. And also when you're trading for a prospect, no matter how hyped they are, you never really know how good they are until you see them play hockey for you at the NHL level through an 82 game schedule. Right. So, a lot of people were obviously very high on Fox at the time, the hype leading into it clearly works out well for the Rangers and Adam Fox. But at the time, you kind the Rangers kind of hedged their bets a little bit of okay, we're going to trade for this guy. But also if he doesn't work out, or if he's not the superstar player that, the people are claiming him to be, Jacob Trouba is here to be that, or at least that's what they hoped, while Adam Fox either continues to develop or, flames out or does whatever. So, logically, I understand the decision. I just wish it didn't happen.
Who's on your second pair?
Brady Shea from 2017, also on an entry level. I know you said 1, but I texted you earlier, and it's he was on his entry level deal at the time, and he was really, building up to be a potential top 2 defenseman for the Rangers until, he kind of fell off and he got to be traded, all that. I like Brady Shea in that season. I thought he was that was really the highest of highs in that era of his career. So I'll take Brady Shea there. And this is a blast from the past. Give me Mr. Kevin Klein from 2015. Making $2.9 million. This was before he fell off completely. He was a solid top 4D that didn't do a whole lot with the puck, but you knew in the defensive end, he was reliable and somebody that could get the puck out of the zone, which is a skill set that for some reason the Rangers have one player that can do that well. So as somebody that won't be playing on the top pair, having somebody like that is invaluable to me. And for that contract, it's hard to say no.
So it's funny you say that, because I have Kevin Klein on my third pair, because I was looking for trying to have as well-rounded a defense as possible. As someone who has lived through the last 15 years of New York Rangers hockey, there was a real part of me that said, I want to overcompensate on defense. I want to have as well-rounded and balanced as 3 pairs as I possibly could, in the interest of making my forward and my goalies' lives easier. Now, you might ask who I have playing with Kevin Klein, and this is where I overspent. Keith Yandel is overqualified to be a third pair lefty, especially at $5.75 million. You could have gone for something cheaper. You could have done Eric Gustafson, which is where I initially had started, but I ultimately opted I'd rather spend a little bit more for the proven established guy. Yeah, he's only going to quarterback power play 2. If you'd rather have McDonough running that, I'd perfectly understand that. But I want 3 well-balanced pairs. I want all 3 pairs to be able to break the puck out cleanly, which the Rangers have never had in my life. And I would like all 3 pairs to I don't need to have the utmost confidence in all of them, but I would like not to be clenching my butthole the entire time they are out there on the ice for that 45 seconds to a minute and a half that they are out there. And those have been few and far between. There are weeks where it feels like, okay, all 3 pairs are going pretty well. And then there are months where it feels like nobody can move the puck out of the zone. So that's where we're at there. But Yandel inclined to round out the defense.
My third pair is Eric Gustafson at $825,000, played in 2024. And also, this is sort of a joke answer. I could have picked Anton Strawman, the money still would have worked if I did pick Strawman. This is kind of a joke one. Give me Calvin DeHaan, 2025 at $800,000. If he actually played hockey for this team, they would have, I'm not saying he's going to win the Norris, but the defense would have looked better than gestures wildly at what happened last year.
Oh, I don't even think that's that much of like a smart ass answer. I think Calvin DeHaan, for what he costs, is pretty good, and that's really the key here. Are you getting what you pay for? And that's been the issue. When they were paying Patrick Nemeth $3 million to be a third paired defenseman, he was giving them negative value on that deal. Same thing with Barclay Goodrow, same thing with Ryan Reeves. It's okay to pay for expensive things. You buy a nice pair of headphones because they're worth it. You buy a $400 or $500 pair of noise canceling headphones because you're going to use them 2 or 3 hours a day, every day for several years. If you're spending that on something you're going to use once every other week, that's not as good of an investment. And that's really the problem you get to in a lot of these, especially when it comes to the depth. The Rangers have really overpaid for depth the last few seasons because they think, well, we're Stanley Cup contenders, and Stanley Cup contenders have great depth. And the problem, of course, is when you're paying market value or higher for depth, there's not a lot of room there. Where if guys fail to meet their expectations, you're overpaying. Like, that is the biggest red flag when it comes to free agency and the cost associated. We always talk about the free agency tax. Guys get paid $1 million, $1.5 million more than they're worth just because it's the first time they have access to the unregulated labor market where they can earn as much as they want. You're almost always going to overpay, and that's the thing. Because if Barclay Goodrow was in at 2.25, 2.5, okay, it's not great, but that's palatable.
That's better.
That's manageable. Same thing with Trouba. If Trouba's only making 5.5, 5 as opposed to 8, it's a lot more manageable. And then you have to think about it in terms of, and this is something we talked about a lot last week, what are you paying for? What are you paying for that shows up in the box score? And look, I think it's very ironic the same people that spent much of the 2010s complaining about Rick Nash not being worth his contract are all enamored with guys who don't put up stats. The knock on Rick Nash, who I will spoil, is in my group.
Same.
Rick Nash was a good but not great hockey player. He signed a contract at top of the market in a small market that knew it had to overpay to keep him. Columbus, they are very much in the same thing they did with Zach Werenski. I think that was 2 years ago when he signed that deal. Probably a little bit more than they're worth at face value. But to get guys to stay there, you need to do that. And the Rangers knew that when they acquired him, that they were paying for top of the market, close to, Rick Nash was one of the highest paid players in the NHL when he signed that deal with the Blue Jackets. And the Rangers knew that in acquiring him. And yeah, his game changed. He got a little bit less offense oriented as he got older, rounded out his game a little bit more to fit what the Rangers did as a team. But then why are we so enamored with third and fourth liners who put up 25 points and they're overpaid? Those two ideas, they're kind of incongruous with each other. You want to pay for tangible things that you can point to. And this is where you get into it with defensive defensemen, like a Kevin Kline, for example, someone who at their best, 25 points, but when you watch the breakouts, when you watch the transition play, when you watch the ability to withstand the forecheck, those things don't show up in the stat sheet. You don't know how good a defense. You can do the same exact thing with today's guys, with guys like Slavin, with guys like Gus Forsling, Matthias Ekholm, Rasmus Anderson, Mackenzie Weegar, those defense first guys. It doesn't show up on the stat sheet. But if you watch night after night, it's the little things. You think about in a given game, a guy who plays a lot, Adam Fox is going to touch the puck 200 times in the course of a hockey game, just on a nightly basis. You're only going to remember the really good and the really bad. You'll remember the turnovers. You'll remember the blown coverages. You'll remember the sick passes. The other 180 of those touches, they get lost to the ether. You're not remembering 200 puck touches of 82 games for an entire NHL career. That's just that nobody has that level of memory yet. Believe me, I try. I really do try, but I can't do it. If I can't do it, no one else can. And that's where you get to with this. That's where you get to with these types of exercises where what are we paying for? So with that said, I will transition talking to my forward group. Now, going forward, I am going to say something that might surprise you here. My first line center is 2019-2020 Mika Zibanejad, who had 41 goals and came in at $5.3 million.
Wow.
41 goals.
Yeah.
In 50 some odd games, because remember, he got hurt in the fall of that year, and he went on the crazy heater in March, capped off with the 5-goal game against the Capitals. But I don't think there's much of an argument that Zibanejad is the best center the Rangers have had in the last 15 years. Now, if you want to argue on like a per dollar basis, or you want to argue a little bit more of a war basis, I suppose you can make an argument for Derek Stepan or Vincent Trocheck, who I have one of those guys in the rest of my lineup, I think, if I remember correctly. But I think when you look at the ceiling and coming out of that pause, coming out of the COVID pause, we all looked around and said, okay, this looks like a guy who took the step. That Rangers team, 1920, bottom 5 defense in the world, but they also scored a bazillion goals to compensate for the fact they were terrible defensively. They played at one of the highest tempos in the entire NHL because, as we talked about before, they ran Fox, Trouba, D'Angelo down the right side. Not a whole lot of defensive defensemen in that group, but lots of breakouts, lots of transition, really high tempo, lots of back and forth, and that creates more opportunities. That's probably the best hockey Zibanejad will play in his life, that March of 2020. And since then, it hasn't been the same, but especially at $5.3 million, the second to last year of that deal, that's a steal. $5.35 million for the season for 39 goals. That's crazy return on investment, not even getting to the playmaking. Left wing, this is somewhere where I definitely overpaid to some degree, but I have the 40-goal Gabrick season there at $7.5 million. And then on the right, Buchnevich at 3.25, 2019-20. Easy money. I mean, 3.25 is really cheap for a first line right wing. And I think just thinking about the practicality of the fits, where Zibanejad gets to do a lot of distributing, Buchnevich does a lot of the puck carrying and the transition work, and Gabrick just lets it rip. I think skill set wise, there's a really good match there. And I think at those price points, I know Gabrick at 7.5 is a little expensive there. Ultimately, the Rangers did trade Gabrick in real life because they couldn't afford to keep him and Rick Nash. Ultimately, it turned into Brassard, John Moore, and a bunch of other stuff, but worked out relatively well there. And Gabrick, I feel like Gabrick gets underrated in the context of the Lundqvist era, just because he wasn't here that long.
No, I totally agree. I wanted to put Gabrick somewhere on my team, but because of the money, I these things tend to sometimes reflect back on what happened in real life. The Rangers couldn't afford Gabrick in real life. I couldn't afford Gabrick on my team, so I had to keep him off. My top line is 2024 Panarin. I mean, when you score, 11.642 million, which is an odd number, but whatever. When you score 1 million points and you are one of the best players on the planet, you are in the conversation for the heart. Like, when you have a season like that, it is impossible for me to leave you off. And yeah, it's a lot of money for $71 million cap hit, especially with me having 2 goalies that are, making combined more than that. But when you had the season Panarin has had, and no other player in the past 20 years, other than Yager, one season in 2005, 2006, came even close to that, it's impossible for me to leave him off. So Panarin gets my top left wing spot. In the middle, I have JT Miller from 2018, making $2.75 million. He scored nearly 60 points that season. You put that Miller with Panarin, he's scoring at least 80, probably 90, probably more. 2.75 is a steal and a half for that kind of for that value. And rounding out my line, of course, the Norwegian god himself, Mats Zuccarello, who at $3.5 million in 2015 was a top 6 demon for the Rangers, and I miss him dearly. Mats, come home, please.
So let me ask you a question off of that. And I think this is a fair question that a lot of Ranger fans have had, and we've debated this. Does JT Miller get to be as good as he does if he never leaves New York? And I really do think that's a fair question, because even in Tampa Bay, who went on to win 2 straight cups and has done a great job of turning, Brandon Hagel had 90 points last year. Tampa Bay does a great job of getting value out of guys. It took 2 separate organizations. It took 2 different locker room schisms. And JT Miller is now, a consistent point per game, can flirt with 100 points in the right year player. Does he ever get there? Because you think about where the Rangers were it's like, if he's not in that Ryan McDonagh trade, they still probably prioritize Zibanejad over him. what does his path to being a 70 or 80 point player look like? Does the contract they need to give him, what did Tampa Bay give him? 5x5, something like that? Does that preempt the ability to go get Panarin, to go get Trouba? Like, you start thinking about the butterfly effect of this, and it forces you to think a little.
Yeah, I mean, the question is impossible to answer just because, like, you just don't know what the trajectory would have looked like if he stayed. Like, how did Tampa directly impact JT Miller's trajectory? There's tangible ways you can argue that. There's intangible ways you can't argue that. Like, it's really difficult to answer. I don't know what JT Miller would have been. Let's just say if he was a Ranger his entire career. But what I will say is that if you put 2024 Panarin with 2018 JT Miller, he's at least, like, I would think, because he scored 60 without Hart Trophy candidate Artemi Panarin at his wing. You put that Panarin with JT Miller, I would have to think he's going to get to at least 80 points. And okay, so you do that, and now all of a sudden, now he gets more confidence to shoot more, and like, maybe he develops it in the same player with a guy like Panarin on his wing, and also Zuccarello there to help him help guide that process along. Maybe he becomes the same player. It's tough to say.
I definitely think these are good thought exercises, because this gets back to something we talk about all the time. Your environment matters almost as much as your talent. It doesn't matter how great you are. At a certain point, unless you're the Connor McDavids, Nathan McKinnons, Austin Matthews of the world, you can't outplay your environment. Even a player as good as Artemi Panarin cannot outplay his environment when they are playing great defensive teams. There are limitations. And that's what separates the all-time greats from the greats, etc. So when you think about where the Rangers were in 2018-19, they trade Miller, McDonough in spring of 2018 to Tampa Bay. Okay, they tear down the roster even further. You trade Zuccarello, you trade Kevin Hayes. Where were the opportunities for guys to play, and what does it do trickle-down effect-wise? Because the counterpoint, and something I think we could talk about for a second, if JT Miller stays and the team is very bad, he has a lot more runway to play more. You think about that 2018-19, 19-20 seasons where Zibanejad got basically unfettered minutes as much as he could play those 2 years under David Quinn, because he realized, okay, this is one of the 5 guys on this team with a pulse. I need to use him as much as I possibly can. And maybe that's your path to JT Miller becoming maybe more of an empty calorie guy, the way people used to talk about Cat on the Timberwolves, where is he a good player on a bad team and putting up a lot of stats, or is he a good player just in a bad situation? And I do think there's something to that, because you need those minutes. And that's ultimately, I think, why guys like Kakko, guys like Ketel, guys like Lafreniere, even Schneider, Keandre Miller haven't necessarily gotten where they should have in their respective developments, because they never got that unfettered burden, because they never got to play all situations minutes on bad teams.
Well, no, the Rangers needed to play Colin Blackwell, so.
Yes. Again, and I'm not saying it's one size fits all. Buffalo has done this for years, where they just throw the young guys to the wolves and say, you'll figure it out. We're not good. You can play as many minutes as you want. And that's worked for Rasmus Dahlin. Hasn't really worked that much for Owen Power. Didn't really work that much for Peterka. I think there needs to be some degree of balance there, but I think these are the types of exercises that make you think about it a little bit more, because you're taking that JT Miller and putting him in that situation. And of course, there's no way to know. That's the point of these types of hypotheticals, to force you to think. So You mentioned Matt Zuccarello. I have him as my second line left wing from 15-16 at $4.5 million. Really good price point. Should be somewhere in the ballpark of 60 to 70 points, depending on power play usage. Center, I have Stepan from 13-14 at $3 million. I think Stepan on the offensive end of things is probably a little low end to be a 2C on a Stanley Cup team. I think he profiles more of a 3C, but at that price point, I think having Gabrick there as opposed to maybe Trocheck on that 2C spot, I think I'd rather have Gabrick and Stepan than, say, Trocheck and one tier down on the wing, whoever that might be. And then on the right, I have Rick Nash at 7.8 from the year he scored the 40 goals, where he arguably would have won the Hart Trophy if he didn't get that concussion late in the season and miss all those games, because he was leading the league in goals for most of that season. And then down the stretch, Jamie Benn ran him down with the lowest scoring output for a Hart Trophy winner of the 2010s.
My second line is mostly the same. I have Rick Nash at $7.8 million from his 2014-15 season. I have Derek Stepan in the 2014 season where he was making 6.5 at that point, but he was, I mean, he's still, even at that price, I think he's more than fine second line center. And rounding out that second line, I have, and this is very cheap because of how the trade happened, Marty St. Louis from 2015 and making $1.153 million with the Rangers because the Lightning took much of that salary.
I was looking for a way to get one of Marty St. Louis, Brad Richards, one of the old heads into this group, but I couldn't find a way to make the math work without like really losing a good player. So ultimately I opted for Buchnevich in that spot. I think St. Louis, vibes wise, really important, obviously an instrumental driving force in the successes of 2013-14 and 14-15. I think frankly, you can make an argument that's been one of the Rangers' biggest shortcomings the last few seasons. Like as much as they want to do it with Quick, tried to do it with Blake Wheeler, Barclay Goodrow, Patrick, guys who had gone far in the playoffs or won Stanley Cups outright in Goodrow. I don't think they had enough talent per se to really be influential driving forces. And I do think that matters. You look at Florida and they had guys who hadn't won on last year's team, but you add a Marchand to that group. And then you think about that DNA, you think about what Colorado added at their deadline when they went all the way and all of the playoff wars those guys had been through. You think about Tampa Bay, all the playoff wars those guys had been through before ultimately breaking through. I think that matters a lot. And I think, again, very similar to what we were saying about environment versus talent, experience matters too. In experience, talent, environment, these are all free-flowing, dynamic elements. Sometimes your confidence just isn't where it needs to be, and you have to account for that, and you need to figure out ways to make it matter more. But as we often say here, you do need to have a certain baseline level of talent for those non-tangible factors to matter. It's one thing for Connor McDavid to say, dig in, let's go here, versus Ryan Reeves saying, okay, let's go here. Those are two very different things, and they manifest very differently. And I think that's what people lose when we have just a pure tangibles versus intangibles debate. You need a certain baseline level of talent to make it matter. Otherwise, you're just talking.
Right. Like, do you want Michael Jordan telling you to get in shape and get out there, or would you rather the guy that's at the end of the bench that isn't Michael Jordan telling you the same exact thing? Like, who are you going to reasonably listen more to, right? Like that's just what you have to think about. Like Ryan Reeves is great in the locker room, like we talked about before. People like him. Say they were with like Barclay Goodrow, guys like that. Very friendly guy, people, but when push comes to shove and you need, like, your team needs a goal, is Ryan Reeves going to give it to you? X is going to give it to you, first of all, but is Barclay Goodrow going to give you the goal? Probably not. Is Michael Jordan going to score? Is he going to take that 3 and score it because that's what his team needs? Yeah, probably. That's the difference. And that's why you listen to Michael Jordan more than you listen to somebody at the end of the bench.
100%. Could not agree more. Okay. Third line on the left. He's played right and left, but for this exercise, I have Lafreniere from 23-24 on the left at $2.325 million. In the middle, I have the last cheap Derek Brassard year from 13-14 at 3.2. And then on the right, this is a bit of an expensive choice, but I have 2011-2012 Ryan Callahan there at $4.27 million on the right.
Yeah, I like that. I was thinking about putting Callahan somewhere, but I just couldn't make the money work. But in my head, I also started at the 12-13 season, so that might have been one of the reasons why I didn't have Callahan in there. My third line is Pavel Buchnevich, $3.25 million in 2020-2021.
Little overqualified.
Yeah. But like Booch and on the third line, and also you can put him up on the second. Like, let's say St. Louis needs, because at that 2015 he wasn't the youngest player on the team. You could definitely move St. Louis down and have him play, a little better of a favorable matchup. Put Buchnevich in the top 6. I'm more than fine to do that. 3.25. My third line center is Will Cooley on his entry level 925K from last season. I mean, you really can't get, like, the value there is incredible. The fact like how he's kept scoring a 5-on-5 was something that like there's no other Ranger that felt like he was doing more than Will Cooley, who, by the way, was making less than $1 million in that contract. So yeah, I mean, he's making more now, but dollar per dollar, the things that Will Cooley was doing at 5-on-5 in a position where no one else even like seemingly touched that level of productivity, I will take that any day of the week. And also rounding out that line is Chris Kreider from 2015 making $2.475 million.
So something I found really interesting about doing this exercise was comparing the price points across pretty wide periods of time. We're talking about 10 years, and the salary cap has doubled in the last 10 years. And Carl Hagelin's last year as a Ranger, he made as much as Lafreniere did on the last year of his RFA deal, which strikes me as crazy. Like, I really like Carl Hagelin, the hockey player. We'll always have the 3-game suspension in the Ottawa series for no real reason other than player safety, just not understanding what player safety does. But Lafreniere was a first overall pick and had a couple 40-point seasons. He had the 119-goal even strength season. And that was the same price point as a guy whose career high in points is like 42. That just strikes me as crazy. The same thing as talking about the goalies. Shesterkin at 5.6 million, one of the best goalie seasons of the last 15 to 20 years. We'll see how that ages over time going up to that 11 million price point. And then you compare that to where Lundqvist was, where he was getting about 5.5, 6 million 10 years earlier, and on a significantly worse team where he had a lot more work to do. And I think that's one of the benefits of doing this type of exercise is just gaining that perspective and a little bit of historical context. Because Shesterkin's new price point is a bit jarring. It is a bit disorienting. But you think about that value in relation to what the alternative is, and really quickly you start to say, well, we're either an awful hockey team or we're not. And that's really the difference here. Like a $6.25 million, a big jump in your payment for one guy. Could you get a pretty decent, you could get Brock Besser for $6 million, $7 million. The difference between Shesterkin and like a mid-tier goalie, like say Joey Decord or Darcy Kemper. I'd rather have the high-end goalie than the one extra winger, at least in that case, because the options weren't great. Let's say, and like real quick as an aside here, like last year, let's say they make the Jake Gensel trade happen and they really need to figure out how they could keep him for the future. Need to figure out. So, okay, you're probably having to move 2 or 3 roster players to facilitate doing that because, well, you just traded for Jake Gensel, so you can't trade Shesterkin, your best player. You need to pay for that raise. Okay, so Miller's done. Will Cooley's probably gone. And then Lafreniere probably doesn't get the extension he gets if you trade for Jake Gensel. That's 7.25, 7.5, whatever it is. Or maybe you trade Chris Kreider a little bit earlier to try and facilitate that. Or
probably what happens.
Yeah, you trade Chris Kreider and then you try and facilitate Lafreniere maybe at a little bit of a cheaper price point. I think that's a reasonable alternative history.
Yeah. So my fourth line, speaking of Carl Hagelin, is Carl Hagelin from 2015 making $2.25 million. As a fourth liner, I really can't imagine a better fourth line, like speedy winger than Carl Hagelin for the things that he does well, and somebody that you can rely on to not get pinned in their own zone too often. I really like Carl Hagelin at that price. And, my center is the 2014 god himself, Brian Boyle, at $1.7 million. Yeah, I mean, the stats weren't quite as high as, as some other seasons. But again, you take a look at how that fourth line played with him there when they went to the Cup final, and it's you really can't complain especially for that price point. And rounding out the fourth line, one of my favorite players in the bottom 6, Mr. Jesper Fast, 2020, $1.85 million. Quickie, we miss you. Come back, please.
It's a good combination. I was between Dominic Moore and Brian Boyle for the fourth line.
Moore also.
I took Dominic Moore just because the defensive impacts were slightly better, but either of those guys is fine. On the left, I was looking for someone with a bit of foot speed, and I found our friend Tyler Mott at a 1.2 million. And at that price point, really good underlying defensive numbers. That works. And then on the right, for $800,000, we're bringing Johnny Brodzinski along for the ride.
He's back. He's never been more back, baby.
I had to save money somewhere, and $500,000 for my backup goalie and $800,000 for my fourth line right wing. Like, I could have found a cheap Jesper Foss year. I mean, I have like $1.5 million left over. I didn't spend all the way up to the ceiling, so like hypothetically, I really could just swap.
Could have put Foss in there, sure,
for Brodzinski. Yeah. You could have got Hagelin in there for Tyler Mott, what have you. But the purpose of doing this exercise was just to put in context where the Rangers are in terms of their talent over the last 15 to 20 years. And I don't want to say they've overachieved relative to their talent, but like they've kind of overachieved relative to their talent here. You know, of this entire cohort, we're talking about Lundqvist is already in the Hall of Fame, but
sure.
We're talking about maybe 2 or 3 guys.
Panarin will get in. St. Louis.
St. Louis, I barely count as a Ranger.
Sure. Fox will get there if he continues.
If he continues, Shesterkin maybe.
Shesterkin probably will as well. I mean, there's maybe reasonable arguments that Shesterkin might not, or if like Fox won't. But if they keep playing the way they will, it gets harder every year to argue against those guys making the Hall of Fame with how they keep playing. And by the way, again, we say this pretty much every episode of the show, but like if you sit here with a straight face and you're going to tell us that Adam Fox wasn't good last year, I have a bridge to sell to you.
So real quick, if you want something they haven't done their projections yet for last season, but I had it up before, so I'll pull it up real quick before we get out of here. I'm looking on Evolving Wild and their points above replacement. So 23-24, Adam Fox was worth $24.4 million, 9.5 against the cap. They got to that evaluation with 8.4 of offense, 7 defense, 3.1 in penalties. So you add all that up, that comes out to about 20. So 8.4 and 7 is 15, 3.1, that gets you to 18.1 plus the 4. So 18.5. This past season, he was about 15. So yes, a little bit worse than the year before, but you have to remember that 10-point disparity in his point production, the 70 from the year before versus the 60 last year, that's entirely power play based.
Yeah.
The power play going from top 10 to bottom 5, that's the 10-point swing there. And that is why the power play ice time is so important. It's why for 3 years, banging the drum, you got to get Lafreniere on there. You got to get Kakko on there. You got to get these guys these opportunities because that's where you get your counting stats. And that's why guys in their late 20s and early 30s, those are the first ones to get those opportunities. And that's why their counting stats usually take leaps. You know, when you sign a free agent contract and you go somewhere else, you get more ice time because that team is materially invested in you now. They are paying you. You know, you could look at Trocheck with this. You look at the time on ice usage jump Trocheck had his last year in Carolina to his first year as a Ranger. And then last year, when you get more ice time, you get more offensive opportunities. And that's the type of challenge for this type of exercise because Will Cooley is overqualified for the role he's in on your team. I would argue, I think a lot of the guys on our third lines are overqualified. I think Lafreniere, Derek Brassard, and Ryan Callahan are all overqualified to be third liners.
Pavel Buchnevich might be the greatest third line player of all time.
Couldn't get in over Tanner Glass in Game 6 against Ottawa, though. Couldn't get in over Tanner Glass.
You had to trade for. Well, I just signed Ryan Reeves and trade for Barclay Goodrow instead of paying Buchnevich the same money. It's fine.
It's fine. All right, that'll do it for this week's edition of Liberty Blue. If you want to take a stab at this, if you're really that bored, by all means, you can drop it in the comments. Let us know on social. Took me about 45 minutes. Andrew, probably about 45 minutes, an hour, something like that.
Yeah.
Puckpedia, Hockey Reference. You can make your own. It's not that hard to do, but it's definitely a little time consuming.
71.5. You cannot exceed $71.5 million. My total was 69. Everybody say it with me.
Nice.
Yeah. $0.415 million. So I was like just over 2 million under the cap. So I had like a little bit of flexibility. You know, like I said, I could have put like Strawman in or whatever, but 71.5 is the top. Cannot exceed that.
71.5 is the cap. You can have one entry-level contract. You need to pick a specific iteration of each player, and the iteration of the player you pick is the cap hit assigned. If you're crazy, by all means, let us know. We will talk to you guys next week. Until then,
later.